Hello, good evening, good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining the Black Belt Academy of Surgical Skills. My name is David O'Regan. I'm a cardiac surgeon in Yorkshire in the United Kingdom, and I'm also the director for the Faculty of Surgical Trainers for the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I'm extremely grateful for your support and following that is now approaching 1,900 people. Before we start this evening, one of my followers in Myanmar, who, by the way, is training for her black belt in Shotokan karate, sent me a message and a video explaining that her hands were very small and was very difficult to keep the scissors at the tips or palps of her fingers, as we were discussing last week. Now, I appreciate that is problematic, but the most important thing is do not get your distal interphalangeal joint through the hole. Try and put your fingers obliquely across the rings such that you're maximizing the feel of the instrument through the palp of your fingers. Many of you might be in the same position, so I hope that answers the question. Please keep the questions coming in, and I did appreciate the video as well. Tonight, we're going to be talking about knots. And I'm sure in learning knots, you too have been tied in knots as well. And the emphasis this evening is going to be on the techniques and how to practice it, but also point out that tying knots also requires a feel. Because if you don't feel how you're tying the knots, and I'll go through simple principles, there's a possibility that your suture would tear through the tissue, particularly diseased tissue that's inflamed or an abscess, or solid organs like the liver or the pancreas. And we'll come to some models later on to explain that. I'm going to go over to the overhead cam, and we're going to go from the beginning and whiz through and point out salient features. I was also thinking I'm going to come back in a later video, which I'll post online, to deconstruct how to tie knots. Because certainly when I started training, it was something that was a mystery to me. And there are plenty of videos on YouTube showing you how to do it over, under, round, over the heel, under the heel, etc. It's what works for you that matters. But I do want to point out some important principles. Bringing you over to the head cam then, I've got my shoes on here because the most important knot that you'll be doing daily are your shoelaces. And you might be wondering why your shoelaces come undone. On the left-hand side here is what's called a granny knot or cross knot. You can see it's crossed, yeah? And if you tie your shoelaces with a cross knot, the loops of the laces point longitudinally down your shoe, so you know you've got it wrong. And why that's important, because if I put my finger in this knot and work it slightly, as you would walking during the day, and your foot's working and flexing and extending, there you go, it comes undone. So a cross knot comes undone. The correct knot is a flat knot, which is effectively, as you can see, flat, and you guessed it, it's a reef knot, right over left and left over right. And you do that with your shoelace. You'll find that the loops extend horizontally across the shoe. And the important feature of this knot is as I pull it and pull it and pull it and pull it, it tightens. Okay? So it does not come undone. And when I started surgery, Mr. William Walter Frederick Southwood would watch my knots and he'd say crossed, which is that, or uncrossed, or flat knot, which is that. And you need to, when starting to learn your knots, talk yourself through crossed and uncrossed knots. So you don't need a jig, as I've got here. 2 elastic bands across a book is absolutely fine. And to learn, it's best to take a shoelace or thick piece of string and have one end dark and the other end light. Because the whole principle of knot tying starts off with understanding that you need one length short and one length long. So effectively, you're creating loops and you need to take the short end. I've got a loop there. I call it a figure of 4 because I like straight lines. I've got a loop there and I'm bringing that loop through around there. I'm bringing it down and bring it towards me, and you can see that's flat. And then come across the other way, you see the loop there, and I've taken my middle finger there, take the short end and bring it through the loop and take it down. And you can see that's flat. And I've mounted it again, and note that my finger mounting alternates between my middle finger and my thumb and my index finger and my thumb. So there's my middle finger and thumb, and I'm deliberately using my left hand because I'm not a left hand knot tyer, to show you the principles. And now it's the other way around, index finger and thumb, where the short end's been held, and my middle finger is going to slip that through. Okay, so there you go, is a whole series of flat knots. And as you do it, note that your hand is moving to and fro, a bit like a loom. They're not crossing at any stage doing this. So I'll undo that again, and I'll do it with my right hand. So you can see both ways. And I do recommend that you learn to tie knots with both hands. I was lazy in doing that from an injury in a wrist, which I found difficult. So here we go. Short end, long end. I've got my figure of 4 there, and I'm taking that short end through the loop and coming towards me. I'm now holding it between the index finger and thumb, and using my middle finger to take that short end through the loop and away from me. I'm now holding it middle finger and thumb. There's the loop, take it through the hole and towards me. Alternating again, middle finger, index finger and thumb through the loop and taking it away from me. And that's the fun thing about doing it. How short can you go? But like limbo dancing, really, isn't it? And you can see how short you can go. So the first principle is when tying knots that you need to actually say to yourself each time, flat, uncrossed knot, and deliberately work out the alternating finger hold of the short end and bringing it through the loop, and your hands are moving back and forth. Well, that's all very well, tying in depth. Well, what we need to do in tie in depth is make sure that the knot is buried down. So here I have 2 half hitches, and you see if I pull that, that buries down and secures itself. And that's the first throw when tying knots at depth, is 2 half hitches, taking it down, and that self-tightens. All right, so let's just have a look at that on this model. So I'm going to do one throw and another throw, all right, and we're going to push this down, okay, 2 half hitches. Whoopsie, that hasn't worked, has it? That's the thing about doing it live. 1, 2, same direction, and now I can push it down. And the important thing is that my finger is pushing on the knot. Okay, and I've buried it down. So you can see it's pulling it together. And now I can continue throwing the knots the other way. Okay, like that. So what you need is a piece of string and a surface and something to tie on. So anything, that is, absolutely anything that is available. So if you're sitting in a chair watching telly, you can tie on the arms. Now I'm using a coat hanger here because it's a solid surface, but also to point out one another important principle. Okay, so I'm going to tie the knot, and I put my finger on the knot because I do not, and a finger across the knot, because I don't want to be lifting this up. I wanted to make sure that I'm pulling across the knot, and usually, especially with smaller sutures, simply putting your finger on the knot stops that. And each time you throw the knot, is make sure that your finger's on the knot and you're not lifting the coat hanger. Okay? So not only now you're practicing the knots flat, and I'm saying flat to myself because you've progressed, I am wanting to make sure that as you tie it, you're not pulling the coat hanger up, that your positioning of your fingers is across the knot and you're not pulling it off the table. Now, this is vitally important, particularly at depth, but on all vessels and ligatures, such that you do not tear the vessel or tear the tissue. Okay, so that is finger on the knot. Now, how much pressure do we need to put on the knot? Well, I'm going to bring you to another model here, and you'll recognize this because I used it in earlier models. This is my bit of foam that we used for clean cut incision. And I've done this, and I'm pretending that I'm stitching this foam. And I've taken a Dexon through here. And what I want to point out now is the other important principle. First, flat knots. Second, make sure the direction of pull across the knot is not going to pull it off. But you don't have to tie the knot tight. And what I want to point out, hopefully in demonstrating this model, is all I want to see is that you dimple the sponge, okay? I'm not pulling it hard. I'm just dimpling it. And certainly those who are doing cardiac surgery would appreciate when tying a valve in the aortic position, I see trainees tying it and tying the knot really, really tight because they think it's in a high pressure system and therefore the knot must be really tight. What I'm looking for is accuracy in the knot tying, but it's the weight of the forearm that actually is dimpling the cushion of the valve, a bit like the buttons on a sofa dimple the sofa. And you do not need it any tighter than that. Okay? So it's simply the weight of the forearm, even in the systemic pressure of the left ventricular outlet and the aortic valve. So what you're doing is effectively bringing the tissue together. Okay? So there are a number of different types of sutures, and you'll see here and spot the difference is that the plastic sutures, effectively, Maxon here and Prolene in blue there, are effectively one piece of plastic that's elongated and elongated into a suture. But you'll see that it has a memory as it comes out the packet, as opposed to a Dexon there and a Vicryl, which is a braided suture that has effectively like a piece of string, and it does not have a memory and is easier to tie, and you don't need to throw as many knots. So, how many throws? Well, on a braided suture, I prefer 4 or 5, depending on the thickness, but 5 in general. And on a plastic suture, I prefer 7. Now, different surgeons have different numbers, but you don't need much more than that as throws, because you can imagine if you're doing 34 sutures around an aortic annulus, starting to throw lots of throws is actually wasting time because it's not adding any more to the operation. I worked with a consultant once who said, "Could you squirt the strings, please, in my hands?" implying that he was going so fast that it was generating steam. Wonderful, I thought. So the important thing with some of these sutures, and I'll demonstrate here, is a 7-0. It's the same thing, the same principle with knotting, the same feel, but even though it's a 7-0, I can still achieve what I want to achieve with a 7-0, and I've just locked that easily. But I can, I'll just try that again. I can tie this down and pull it together, even with a 7-0, okay? And that is finger on the knot. And what I'd like to see when in cardiac surgery, the 7-0s, is that the fingers on the knot to make sure it's bedded down, but also if I pull it too tight, being a 7-0, there you go. That would break off and that would cheese wire through the tissue. Okay, so next stage, all right, is now we're going to practice tying knots on solid surfaces. And the material I use for practicing knots that I hope is readily available wherever you are, I use dental floss. And it comes in a nice roll. And indeed, some surgical ligature rolls used to come in exactly that, a roll like this. And the knot that we're going to use for tying a drain in, because this is another important knot, is 2 throws the same direction. All right? You see that? 1, 2, same direction. And the important reason for doing this is to ensure that the knot or the suture bites into the tissue, the plastic. All right, so I'm going to put 1 knot and over again, round through the hole. And you can see there's 2 throws. And what's great about this knot is that if I press it down, you can see that it's biting into that little bit of hose pipe. Your drain stitches will not come out if you put that 2 throws the same direction. There you go. And to test that it's secure, get a pair of forceps and see if I can wiggle it up and down. Very little. And that would be a secure way of tying in your knot. Many of our knots are actually done at depth. And there's a very nice way you can practice tying knots at home is simply taking a pencil through a paper cup, putting the paper cup on a bit of chewing gum or blue tack on a plate, and now you're tying at depth. You can try it at 1 phalanx depth or 3 phalanges deep. The important thing is that as you're tying it, I note that I'm knocking the camera each time I'm doing this, so apologies. As I'm tying it, I do not want to pull the cup off. So I'm just going to also show you, while I'm at it, is a little trick for passing a suture around. And I'm having to peer past the camera here. Passing a suture is to mount it, ideally on a Leahy or Roberts, like that. And you can bowstring it across and allows you to pass it under whatever you want to tie. I'm taking it down, take it under, and then it's actually for Leahy. I'm not going to do it. There you go, and undo it and take it round. I prefer something longer than this, and for next time I will get a Leahy or Roberts. So, the important thing about this is being able to tie the knot at depth, and the important thing is to get your finger down on the knot all the way down and ensure that it doesn't come off. It's actually falling off on me today. But I'm not pulling the cup off. And to ensure that is bedded down, I again use a pair of forceps and see if that's secure across the pencil. And you can do that at a number of depths, 1 phalanx, 2 phalanx, and 3 phalanges deep. Right, so just coming on to the last bit, and this is literally homing surgical skills. The first thing to say is that your prolines, being plastic, are a bit like cheese wires. And if stitching an aortic vessel with multiple throws, that's 7 throws on there, you can imagine that if I take my needle through this banana on this side, that knot is going to be pulled through the banana. So simple advice with a continuous proline on a vascular anastomosis. Make sure you take your knot across vascular anastomosis. But this is where if you put too many knots on here, even if you do go across, there's a potential that you will drag this knot into the opposite side, and that will cause bleeding, and you'll be left wondering why. And that's because you put too many throws on the knot. So feel an appreciation of the tissue and the knots is important. And the models that we use with the Black Belt Academy, as you see here, are predominantly or always organic material. And these are difficult. They're deliberately difficult because it want you to appreciate that it requires a lightness of touch in all the actions, and that the sutures can actually tear out of the tissue. So skin suturing is coming back to this, the proline, a double throw the same direction. And that is effective. 1, 2, over the needle holder, take it down, see it's flat, take it across to the side, and I can lock it. And in locking that, I can now finish my suture. But the thing about the banana is if I am actually too rough, it is possible to tear the skin. And if I'm not pulling my instrument tie across the knot, again, it is possible to tear the banana. So the advantage of this model, it gives you feedback and feel and positioning. Now, what I tried earlier is something a colleague recommended. He said that hepatic surgeons or pancreatic surgeons often practiced tying knots on tomatoes. So I got a beef tomato here and tied a knot in and tried to pull the two edges together as he recommended. And again, I thought to myself, as a model, that was pretty good because I could see it tearing out there and I had to pull this together. So I'm going to continue to practice on that. And Ashok, I thought that was a challenging model. And having taken the banana out of its skin, I wondered if I could actually tie a knot and complete a knot in the banana without it tearing. And that is even harder. But sometimes the tissues you're tying are very, very soft. And I put it to you, would not hold sutures at all. But inflammatory or infected tissue, as you would see in an aortic root abscess, you would debride it back to healthier tissue or tissue that holds a knot and holds a suture. And this is getting to know the feel of the tissue and how to practice. I hope I've stimulated your thinking, and I hope I've stimulated you to practice and demonstrated that we can take a lot of models at home to practice our skills in various ways. And since we're actually entering the festive season, I blew up these balloons earlier, and I tied it about 4 hours ago, and I tied them with dental floss. And you can practice your knot tying and see how accurate it is by tying off balloons during the festive season and see if they actually hold. Okay? And those are the ones I did earlier. So I'm sure you'll be blowing up balloons for many celebrations. Now you don't have an excuse not to practice. Instead of tying the balloon off, use some dental floss and practice your knots. There you go. I'm happy with those. Balloons have not gone down. Thank you very much for joining me this evening at the Black Belt Academy of Surgical Skills. Do continue with your questions. I'd love to see your videos and examples of your practice at home. I'm going to wish you a good day, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And I hope you join me again next week as we'll look at our forceps and again reinforce the importance of the feel of the surgical instrument. Thank you. Do visit the website. I will be doing a basic video on knot tying and be posting that up shortly. Be well.